Welcome to Professor Game Podcast, where we interview successful practitioners of games, gamification, and game thinking who brings the best of their experiences to get ideas, insights, and inspiration that help us in the process of getting the students to learn what we teach. And I'm Rob Alvarez. I teach and work at IE Business School in Madrid, where we create interactive and engaging learning materials. Want to know more? Go to professorgame.com/subscribe, start on our email list, and ask me anything. Hello, Engagers. Welcome to another episode of the Professor Game Podcast. And today we have Chris with us. But before we introduce you, Chris, are you prepared to engage?
I'm always prepared to engage. Game on.
Let's do this because he is the Virtual Agile coach, a people-first champion, and an Agile Evangelist, Agile Transformation Lead, Scrum Master possessing over 8 years of experience within the IT industry. And he also facilitates titled the Agile Arcade. He is a vlogger, a speaker, a coach, and a trainer who always seeks to gamify content to enable consumers to connect to the subject matter and have fun while doing so. And he is working on a book called the Virtual Agile Playbook, and it says here that it will be free. So keep an eye out for that, Chris. Is there anything we're missing from that intro?
I think that synopsis covers everything, so we're good to go.
Sounds great, because we always like to get started with a very simple question, Chris. We want to be sit around in your shoes for a while. So we want to know, what does it feel like to be Chris? What is it like to be Chris in a day like today? What do you do? What is your day composed of?
It feels pretty great to be Chris, to be honest. I tend to wake up, I go for a nice walk to clear my head. I'll do so either reading an audiobook or listening to a bit of music, and then I will start my day, jump on my work laptop, and that can be wherever I'm in the world at the time, because I'm obviously the Virtual Agile coach. And I will start planning my day in terms of what I have to do. That might be facilitating various Agile ceremonies, be they retrospective sprint planning. It might be teaching a new concept or introducing a concept through an abstract medium, usually gamifying them. That's pretty much it, to be honest. It's various ceremonies, meetings, ways of promoting agility at the enterprise level. And as mentioned, I always use gamification as my key way to do that. So gaming is a huge part of my life.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So let's get started with one of the questions that we really enjoy, and not because we enjoy failure, but because we enjoy learning from failure, because we know it is part of life, especially in the world of games. So, Chris, is there something that you could call your maybe your favorite failure or first attempt in learning? One of those times when you wanted to go, north, things went south. We want to be there with you. We want to experience that, know what you learned from it. How do you get out of it if you did? We want to be there with you, basically.
Sure. So I love the question, because for me, I'm someone who believes in failing always. I use the moniker learn fast, learn often. I don't believe failure is a bad thing, and we need to destigmatize it. So I'm always keen to share my failures, my war stories, my scars and battle wounds and things like that. And the example I can think of that I'd like to tell you guys about today is I was sharing a new game of my own creation. It was called the Agile Escape Room. And the way it would work is you'd be introducing agility, agile software delivery approaches and methodologies to a group of people, and doing so using the Agile Manifesto and gamifying it. So it was an escape room. So I would walk into the room and I'd say, right, guys, you're not allowed to leave this room. You've got an hour to escape, otherwise you're not getting lunch. Obviously, I couldn't physically lock them in the room, but I had to try and create some sense of urgency and danger. And then from there, it was up to those guys to go and explore, find various clues and tricks. And essentially, they were trying to find a 4-digit code that was somehow unlocked within various puzzles around the room. That 4-digit code would open a lockbox. That lockbox had the key inside. Now, one of the games that I prepared involved what was essentially a maze that was on the floor in tape. I basically had to map this maze on the floor that morning using tape. And what you would do is your team would guide you through that maze blindfolded. Now, in various points of the maze were mines, represented by Post-it notes. I aspired to make this game as out of the box as possible so that anyone could create it using anything you have lying around the office. So we had these Post-it notes representing mines, and you'd be guided through the maze by your team blindfolded. Now, a failure I can particularly mention on this occasion was that the tape I used didn't stick down very well. So it basically meant that the first person walking through that maze destroyed it. Oof. And it meant that whole game was ruined in seconds. My failure in that respect was to test the maze myself. to make sure that it wasn't going to fall apart straight away. So I lost one of my games and I had to pivot quickly towards another way of teaching that concept. The reason behind that concept was to build trust and rapport with your team, to experiment with how they could improve iteratively by getting their teammates through the maze with less instructions over time. So again, representing agile ways of working, trying to get more efficient at the way you do things. And yeah, that was a particular failure of mine. So my own failure was failing to test something before unleashing it to those I was trying to teach the concept to.
You needed a bit more of play testing, perhaps, right?
Absolutely.
Interesting. That's a good story. And I think the playtesting phase is very important. Maybe you could even say that was your first playtest. But of course, there's the stakes, every now and then there are stakes and stakeholders, and you want to make sure that when those are the ones who come in, you have things at least, a bit more tested, which I'm sure is a lesson that you've taken to heart for future occasions. And we've talked about failure and how you came out of it, but we want to go for a time actually of something that you maybe one of those proud moments. You set out to do something and, in the first, the second, or the nth time, it actually went well. So we want to be there with you. We want to share that success of a time with you.
Sure. I'll give you another story then. So, and this time around, it's another game. It's a game called the Gauntlets of Technical Debt. If you're familiar with technical debt in the software delivery world, it can be quite an abstract concept. And there's a game that I had used delivered in person as a training concept. And the way it would work is you'd split your participants up into either developers or testers, and there would be whiteboards at other sides of the room, and they would physically have to run at other sides of the rooms to deliver one post-it note to the other board, and then a tester would grab it and put it on their own board, and it was very frenetic. And then over time, you would start to introduce chairs in the way, the chairs representing technical debt. And obviously, it becomes more complex, more difficult to navigate your way around that room safely because you've got these barriers in the way. These represent technical debt. They slow down the process. And the same thing happens with software delivery. Now, this is a game you could run in person. Unfortunately, obviously what's happened this year is we've been unable to be in person these days. So I had to adjust that game and make it into a virtual medium. So using an online whiteboarding tool, I basically adjusted this game. So rather than physically running back and forth, you still had post-it notes. You had quite a large virtual whiteboard, and you'd have to drag these post-it notes from one side of the board to the other. But to introduce the technical debt on this occasion, I had to introduce mazes that you had to move the post-it notes through. And obviously, the more complex the maze becomes, the more technical debt has built up. And it culminated with, in the final rounds, I was trying to introduce the importance of dealing with technical debt as you go along, rather than allowing it to build up. So in the final round, as you deliver one thing through the workflow, you get to introduce a pathway through that maze. So over time, you start to build more sustainable delivery practices, and you start to reduce your technical debt, enabling you to move faster. So that's a particular favorite game of mine, a particular challenging abstract concept in technical debt that I solved by creating a virtual game that was accessible to everyone. And it's free on my website. You can download and access yourself. So it's widely accessible.
That makes a lot of sense, and it's a very, very interesting way to sort of physically and then virtually introduce a concept that is so abstract. It's always those concepts that I would argue that many times get people, and it's like, well, yeah, but what is this really about? What do you mean when you say that? What are the real consequences? And technical debt, as you very well portray in your game, is a very, very clear concept in that sense. So, Chris, we've been talking about some of your attempts, failures, and successes. We want to know when you approach a problem that you want to solve using games, using gamification, how do you do it? Do you have some sort of process? How do you approach these kinds of things? Let's say you're going to fix something or do something tomorrow that's related to this. How do you approach it? What are the steps if you have a process?
I do have a process, and it's called the 4 C's. Are you familiar with it?
Nope.
No? Okay. So the 4 C's begins with connections. So I will start by ensuring that not only do the attendees connect with one another on a personal level, especially more important in these days where we can't be face-to-face and having those conversations. So it starts with some sort of icebreaker or a connection to the content. So, for example, if I was doing a retrospective that was superhero themed, I'd probably have a superhero themed icebreaker. Connect the attendees to each other, but then also connect them to the subject matter. And each of my virtual games in particular follow this process. So it starts with connections. So if I was doing a game that was introducing outcomes versus outputs, I would first connect the attendees to the subject matter by asking them what do they understand outcomes and outputs to be individually? How have they used those in their working lives? So we start to connect to the subject matter. Then we go into the second C, which is all about contextualizing. So why is this important to us right now? Outcomes versus outputs is a particularly challenging one because people often, particularly in the software delivery world, end up being given solutions. They don't get given problems to solve. They get given outputs to deliver, and it's far less motivating. It's far less enjoyable to be part of, and it stifles creativity. So having connected them to the subject matter, having contextualized why it's important, we then look to go do some concrete practice, trying to represent the importance of it and how we can think about it differently through a game and through a workflow. So in the outcomes versus outputs game, what I would do is I would divide people into different groups, and I would say, right, your challenge, your brief is to draw a beautiful summer meadow. That's the name of the game. Difference is that team one over here, you're going to be given one brief, and team two, you're going to be given a separate one. And team one's brief is an outcome-based brief. Team two is an output-focused brief. And you just split them up, separate them into breakout rooms, and allow them to run the game. They get 2 minutes to draw this in silence. And then afterwards, you bring them back, and this brings you back to the last C, which is conclusions. So based on this game, what have you discovered? How was it? What did team one do versus team two? And what can we identify and draw conclusions from that? And what you'll find, because team two have been given this output-focused brief, which is really requirement-specific, it's really detailed, whereas the outcome-focused brief is more open and you can interpret it in your own way. The result of playing this game is that the team with the output-focused brief often forget the outcome in mind. So they end up doing really specific drawings of certain things, but they don't end up drawing a beautiful summer meadow. And then the conclusions they can draw from that is, okay, so how does this translate back to our working lives? When we are given outputs to deliver, we end up focusing on the detail without actually solving the problem. So the 4 C's is my approach for gamifying things.
That makes a lot of sense. Can you do a very, very quick recap of the 4 C's?
Absolutely. So it begins with connections, connecting the people and the attendees to each other and the subject matter. We then look to contextualize why it's important. So an example being, we can contextualize the subject outcomes versus outputs. We then look to go through the third C, concrete practice, trying to replicate the importance of that particular concept in the workflow, usually through a game in my instance. And the last C is conclusion. It's almost like a retrospective on the topic. It's what have we learned from that and what can we do differently next time?
It makes a lot of sense. So thank you very much for that, Chris. Just a quick break before we continue. Are you enjoying this podcast? If you're listening through a podcasting app, please subscribe and rate us on the app. This will be of great help to reach more engagers so we can change the world together through gamification. And Chris, we've been talking about, all these things, all these processes, all these creations that we've had. But can you tell us if you found that there is some sort of best practice, something that when you're creating one of these things that, again, it could be gamified, could be a game, one of these agile learning experiences that you create, when you're doing that, is there some sort of best practice or something that is close to being a silver bullet or something that would definitely improve a project if you apply?
So I'm a firm believer there is no silver bullets or panaceas to many situations. And I think you do need to bear in mind the situation in hand and the people at hand, because the problem with standardizing is that you don't take into account the biggest variable, which is the people. Each people are different. Each person or group or team might have different needs. I guess the only thing that I would do, and this is my best practice approach, is understand them, listen first, understand them, and then tailor your approach accordingly. So an example, if I was working with a certain demographic, a certain group of people that I know they like a certain type of music, I'd be more inclined to make an immersive experience around their preferred type of music than if I was with perhaps a different group that I knew were largely into video games. I'd probably introduce a game or an immersion experience around video games. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. It's thinking about your players, which are always central and fundamental in any creation that you are having.
Completely.
So, getting into recommendations, you gave your first one, that best practice of taking into account your players and creating, designing for them. Is there somebody that you think would be interesting to interview in this podcast? Somebody you would like to listen to in an interview like this one in Professor Game?
There is. For me, I think this one might come a little bit out of left field. The guy's name is Dennis Dyack, and he's the creator or the director of a video game that I played when I was younger. It was released in 2002. It was a game called Eternal Darkness. The reason for this is that it was the most immersive experience of a video game of its era that I ever came across. This game was called Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, and part of the experience was that it started to make you actually feel like you were going a little bit crazy. So as an example, you would be navigating through a real-world map and you would go through a door, and then suddenly you'd start to experience weird things, like the screen would flash up and say, oh, your controller's unplugged. And you're like, my controller isn't unplugged. What's going on? Like there was genuinely a sanity meter along the top. And as that decreased, the more crazy things would happen. Suddenly your screen would disappear and you'd be like, what's going on? Or his body parts would start falling off one by one and you'd be attacked by something invisible. There was just all sorts of random effects that would happen. And to me, that was such an immersive experience that I think it was one of the things that inspired me to create and gamify things, because I was so immersed inside it that I enjoyed it. And it helped me connect to the game even more so.
And understand what was going on and what maybe have a glimpse into what that insanity could look like, which I guess was one of the purposes of that creator, right?
Completely.
So that sounds like an amazing potential guest, and maybe we could have this person on the podcast in the future. We'll see. But it would be quite interesting to see those perspectives of that immersion, because again, sometimes games, as you were saying, are used for a purpose, and you want people to experience something. So that makes sense, actually. So again, with recommendations, is there any book that you would tell this audience that you would recommend? Something that we maybe should read?
There is. There's a book called Game Storming. It's by Dave Gray, Sonny Brown, and James Macanufo. And it's a book, a bit of a playbook for innovators, rule breakers, and change makers is how it's described. But it's a game that's about innovating. It's about how you can create immersive experience. It includes a lot of games you can play to improve communication, break down barriers, create ideas and strategies and all sorts of things like that. Overcome conflict. There's various things and options you have in that playbook. But for me, that was one of the things that I read, I liked, and it enabled me to think about other ways of doing things, and particularly gamify even more.
Game Storming. So there you go. Very interesting. It has a very nice teaser by Chris. So Chris, what would you say is your superpower in this world of gamification? That sweet spot, that thing that you probably do better than most.
Oh, this is an interesting one. My superpower, I think, has to be the fact that I'm completely fearless. It's either that or have this regenerative ability. Think Deadpool. Deadpool loses a limb and it regrows back. This is the same with me. I'm fearless or able to regenerate even if I'm damaged, even if something goes horribly wrong. It just doesn't bother me, it doesn't faze me, and I carry on and do something different. So when I, for example, in the gaming context, if I fail miserably, I don't mind. Doesn't bother me. It'll bounce back off me, and I'll just create another game and do it again, or learn from it. Importantly,
very useful, very powerful, especially in this world where I would argue, and it's one of the lessons that we have from the creation of games and game design. It's not about getting it right the first time. It's about actually being able to get it really right by probably iterating more than once. So that is definitely a superpower. And what would you say, Chris? And this is probably one of the most difficult questions of the podcast for many of the interviewees. What would you say is your favorite game?
Oh, yeah, it's so difficult because just like with books, if anyone asks me, the best I can give them is a top 5 rather than any individual game, because there are so many. I'm gonna go back to video games now. There's going to be Final Fantasies in there, Final Fantasy 7, immersive role playing game. There's probably Skyrim in there somewhere. There's Mario Kart. There's GoldenEye for the Nintendo 64. Yeah, there's just so many games that are just springing through my mind right now. I couldn't possibly.
Oh my goodness, GoldenEye of the Nintendo 64. Those sweet times.
I know, and if you try and play it nowadays, it's just not the same. The controls feel clunky. The pixels spread so much. It's just I think it's just it's perfect in my mind as it was. I don't want to play it again.
I'm playing Fortnite out of 007 nostalgia.
Very cool.
That makes sense. Those are great games. And Chris, we have time today, and we will approach this random question that we get every now and then, especially when we do have some time left in an interview. And I will pick a question randomly from the audience that they have sent it beforehand, and hopefully you'll give us an insightful answer. So here it comes. Okay. How do you find out if your game idea will be right for your learners? Your players, I'm guessing. And I guess it also makes sense with your recommendation as well.
How do I find out? Quite simply, I will ask them. I'll test it with them. As I said, I'm fearless in that approach. So as long as you approach it with a bit of vulnerability and just admit, right, this isn't perfect, it's not final, but I'd love to hear your feedback. I find most people are very on board with that. The other alternative you have there is to test it with perhaps some other gamers beforehand. And this is something I learned from my failure we talked about previously, where I did that game, that play testing you talked about. I didn't play test it, that was a failure, and I put it live with people before it was ready. What I tend to do now is, as part of my Agile Arcade meetup, that is one of my forums to say, right, guys, got this new game, experimenting with it. It's not quite ready for the general public yet. It's not quite ready for real play, but I'd love to hear your feedback. Could it be better? Could we do this differently? Have I missed something? So for me, it's definitely either just explore it with some like-minded professionals first, some other fellow gamers, and get their feedback, or be vulnerable and open. Just start with it, admit that it's a bit raw, it's not quite ready yet, and learn from it from there. A great quote that I learned from a colleague of mine, Carl Adamson. He said, if you release something and you're not a little bit embarrassed about it when you release it, you've probably released it too late.
I think, and I'm not sure if that is the original quote, but it's from the founder of LinkedIn. I think that quote of, if you're not embarrassed by the time you ship it, you've probably shipped it too late.
Sounds about right.
Something like that. And it is fantastic. I do think, especially again in this agile world, in this world of game design, so many things that we've learned from that is, one of them is that play testing has to happen as early as possible. That is the best way where you can find out if what you're creating is right. But I would even take it a step behind, because that's something that Chris mentioned before. Think about them. Analyze them as much as you can, understand them as better as you can, and then, of course, go ahead and reach out, test it with friends and family, then test it out with people who are close, akin to that final potential user that you would have there. And of course, before you launch it live, test it maybe with 1, 2, or more final users if you can, to see if there's anything that's still left around that you can fix, that you can improve. And then, of course, the big launch. It doesn't mean you can't improve, you can't change and make things better. But of course, you've gone through all these steps, and your success is going to be closer to you, hopefully, and you'll be able to have gone through many of the hoops that you probably would have needed to go after the launch, which is not what you want. So, Chris, is there anything that you want to leave the engagers with? Any final piece of advice before you tell us as well where to find you?
Yeah, I would say if you're keen on trying gamifying things, if you've never done so before, come and join the Agile Arcade. This is a free meetup. There's currently just working in the GMT time zone, but I'm looking to expand out to other time zones as well, a bit more inclusive. There you can meet with fellow gamers, you can practice some games, you can suggest your own. There's also a lot of resources online for gamifying things. So try tastycupcakes.org. There's a lot of agile-focused games on there, where most of them are, in fairness, face-to-face, but they can be, with a bit of creativity, converted to remote ways of doing things. Those would be my starting points. And I guess to reflect back on the previous question, just try it. Just do a quick feedback loop, do an experiment, learn from it, and iterate from there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Chris, where can we find you again, whether it's in the world of the internet, social media? How can we get in contact and know more about Chris, the Agile Coach?
Various ways. So you've got www.thevirtualagilecoach.co.uk. That's my website. On there, there's lots of free templates and resources about making agility work virtually, including that's where we'll be hosting my book, which is being delivered in an agile way, by the way. There will be chapter by chapter delivery with feedback sort and even allowing the audience to prioritize the next chapters. So it's going to be delivered in an agile way. So we get a lot of feedback iteratively as we go along. LinkedIn is the Virtual Agile Coach again. And same with YouTube. You can find me on the Virtual Agile Coach at YouTube.
Interesting. Many places to find you, a lot of information for us to digest, a lot of free resources as well, which is always very well appreciated. So thank you very much, Chris, for investing this time in this audience and the engagers, and sharing your experience, the things that you've done, your processes, so much knowledge and things that have happened to you, which are always useful for us to get inspired. So thanks again, Chris. However, for now, and at least for today, it is time to say that it's game over. Hey, engagers, thank you for listening to Professor Game Podcast, and I hope you enjoyed this interview. And I'd like to know if you have any questions that you would like to ask future guests, like the one that we asked here. All you have to do is go to professorgame.com/question and ask that burning question that you have. If it is selected, and you have pretty good chances, it will come up in a future episode and you will receive your answer live. And of course, before you go on to your next mission, remember to subscribe using your favorite podcast app and listen to the next episode of Professor Game. See you there!